When Mr. Brady asked me to speak on this occasion a few months ago, I was honored. I recognized the privilege it would be to reflect on one of the cardinal virtues, especially alongside the other speakers. Thank you, Mr. Luddy, Dr. Esselin, and Mr. Brady for your thoughts. Now, if I may confess, it did not take long for that initial feeling of excitement and anticipation to give way to trepidation. Who am I to speak about the meaning of justice? Fortunately, I am a classical educator and have at my disposal the ideas of some of the greatest time-honored human thinkers, what they thought justice means, what they wrote about that somehow captured what justice looks like, or perhaps a lack of it. I do not need to pretend to be an expert on the nature of justice. I am not a trained moral philosopher, but I do have a vested interest in understanding what it means to be just. As a humanities teacher at a school that seeks to help students develop their character and cultivate virtue, it matters to me that young people are able to wrestle with ideas of justice for the betterment of their education and lives. Cicero said justice is the crowning glory of the virtues. He said we are born for it. While humans are wired with an innate sense of justice and a desire to see justice upheld, even a cursory examination of history reveals that the concept of justice has at times been seen as fluid or elusive. Younger generations in this modern world are known for their empathy, but if you ask them what justice is, they may only offer a generalization. Justice is social, or justice is something to be demanded. Look a little closer, and you see that their feelings are tethered only to the whims of a fickle society. It is my hope that students who are classically educated, who have spent time studying and discussing the ideas of the Western tradition, might see and do things differently. Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, they all grappled with justice, and we are indebted to their works. Similarly, Homer, Shakespeare, Dickens, and Dostoevsky created characters who lived in fundamentally human ways and thus captured the essence of justice. All of this is to say, I believe classically educated students are better equipped to navigate the complexities of civil society and witness the realization of stable, life-giving justice in the world today. Now, I keep using this word justice. I want to move away from the notion of justice as an abstraction, simply an idea with a definition. I'm thinking of the Greek word arete, which refers to the fulfillment of excellence, of virtue. It's an action, it's an activity, it's a doing of something, and doing it well. Unfortunately, for many, virtues have become merely conceptual. We aim to spot virtue here and there, rather than to come to really know what it means to be virtuous. I'm trying to imagine Flannery O'Connor, an unapologetic critic of abstract themes, the indignation she would have expressed if she were asked to summarize the meaning of justice in one of her works. I bet she would have retorted, well, did you read the story? Similarly, what would Socrates think if what he so carefully examined were reduced to encyclopedic cliches? In fact, in Plato's The Republic, Socrates engages in dialogues to dismantle overly simplistic assertions about justice. To say that justice is people getting what they deserve or to each his due does not take into account why people are deserving of justice or ought to be just. Plato wants us to crave, investigate, and discuss truths about justice, not be satisfied that it hopefully happens in the courts and in society. Justice is something we must cultivate within ourselves and not only hope to see achieved. How then do we acquire justice as a virtue, an action to be just and to receive justice? How do we better understand it? We do not need programs, offices, or campaigns. What we need is literacy and conversation. It begins with good teachers, good books, and good methods in the classroom to help students better understand justice and strive to be just. Today, I would like to focus on two ways I think we as teachers can encourage students to encounter justice or any virtue in the classroom. First, we should train them to have intellectual discipline. They ought to show a willingness to temper emotion in pursuit of the truth so that they can examine issues with discipline and discernment. Then, secondly, we should release them to practice thinking about justice by exercising their moral imagination through storytelling. Thus, when students examine an issue that pertains to justice, for example, they can regulate their emotions and offer empathy that is firmly grounded in reality. Now, how does a classical educator help students practice intellectual discipline? This is done primarily through the humanities, the process of seminar and smaller discussions centering on the great conversation. The Western tradition is partly predicated on great intellectuals asking the questions that lead to human flourishing, which are essentially issues of justice. Whether it is Aristotle wondering about man's need for community, Aquinas thinking about natural law, or Edmund Burke elevating stability in political change, there are perennial questions that students in search of purpose and meaning crave answers to. Though they may not consciously state as much, young people want to live in a world governed by order and moral absolutes that uphold the dignity of the human person. Alice von Hildebrand explained this excellently at the end of her memoir. She said, "There are things that do not change, which have an absolute and transcendent validity, and which every person has a right to know. Religiously, morally, humanly, and politically, our great nation can only hope to survive if it stands firmly on the ground of truth and gives its children the bread for which they hunger. This is the great task of education." She is correct. When students develop intellectual discipline, they can realize that justice is not merely a buzzword to be thrown about, but something serious we humans have been in pursuit of and find more perfectly over time. A just person ought not simply act based on emotionally charged feelings. Rather, he must respond in an intellectually disciplined way, relying on reason and prudence. I recently came across a quote by former Secretary of State George Marshall that I had not seen before. This is always a very nice surprise for a history teacher. He stood before the Virginia Military Institute's graduating class of 1956 and exhorted them. He said, "Don't be a deep feeler, but a poor thinker." It made me think of Lady Justice, who is always depicted as blind. She is not supposed to see or react to emotional stimuli because that is not the foundation of justice. She raises the scale and weighs the evidence. When we control our emotions, we allow for more civil discourse marked by genuine willingness to navigate through an issue rather than invent provocative, hopeless obstacles. Students who imitate this type of conversation through discussion in class may be more likely to see a path forward. Through an issue, they may be likely to see a path forward, to treat others justly and welcome the same treatment in return. When Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his letter from Birmingham jail on scraps of newspaper, when he said there are just and unjust laws, he was not just reacting. He was angry, but his thoughts were deliberate, accurate, and enlightened. He knew and defended the Bible. He knew and referenced history. He knew and explained philosophy. In this document, which I hope you've had a chance to read, he built a justification for his own civil disobedience. He was in jail for petitioning without a proper permit, an ordinance he deemed to be from a position of discrimination. And in so doing, he asked us not to be hypocrites in consideration of the traditions that have led to human flourishing. He held up a mirror, forcing his readers to consider their decisions in light of received wisdom. And what did he do at the end of his letter? He asked for forgiveness if he seemed unreasonably impatient or to have over or understated the truth. Even with all his academic and experiential expertise, not to mention his remarkable rhetorical skills, he wrote with self-control and closed with humility. This is a great example of my point today. Classically educated students have the authority of a tradition, not merely their own subjective experience when considering questions of justice. That said, as students develop intellectual discipline, they also need to play. There is no better place, I would argue, for a young person to test out his understanding of virtue than through storytelling. Stories are the playground for students to use their moral imagination. Edmund Burke, often credited with coining the name for this phenomenon, described the moral imagination as being owned by one's heart and ratified by his understanding. While we need to use reasoning as we navigate this world, it is our imagination that helps us see ourselves in it and part of it. C.S. Lewis echoed these sentiments when he wrote in an essay, "Reason is the natural organ of truth, imagination is the organ of meaning." In agreement with Burke and Lewis, I contend that it is the realm of the imagination, that it is in the realm of the imagination that students work out the complexities of a life lived in pursuit of virtue. Dictionary definitions have no bearing on the soul. It is only when our students live out moral dilemmas through literature and confrontations with philosophy and history that they come to see the meaning of what were once mere abstractions to them. With these assertions in mind, you get a pretty full picture of what the classical model provides. Through thorough, active reading and rich dialogical discussion about a time-tested story or a well-told account of the past, young people's moral imagination is put to work. Whether in history or fiction, stories are where justice comes alive. It has been no better understood, I would argue, than when rescued from empty proverbs and catapulted into worlds where people tried to be just and where they failed to be just. Surely you can think of some book, some literary or historical conundrum in which you too have encountered questions of justice. I dare say everybody in here could point to something that has helped form your moral compass. And I hope it is not a social media post. In his book, cleverly titled How to Destroy the Imagination of Your Child, Anthony Esselin, who we just heard from, described the imagination as such. The imagination opens out not principally to what it knows and finds familiar, but to what it does not know, what it finds strange and half-hidden. This is why we read books. It is in these worlds where I believe young minds struggle to orient themselves at first, but then eventually find their way and thrive. The stories our children read, from 1st through 12th grade, provide the mirrors by which they examine themselves and human nature. As Wilfred Maclay wrote, we are at our core remembering and story-making creatures, and stories are one of the chief ways we find meaning in the flow of events. Mortimer Adler put it even simpler. A good book can teach you about the world and about yourself. In fact, I would contend that if our students do not see books this way, if we educators do not see books this way, then we have lost the plot. 5 minutes spent in your local public library will tell you that there's a war being fought over the minds of our youth through literature. The text we set before our students matters. Now, as you may have noticed, I have not given you a very clear definition of justice. Allow me to practice what I preach. I'm going to spend just a few moments illustrating my remarks in this talk from a few stories that mean a lot to me. Mark Twain did not preface The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn with a declaration that slavery is unconscionable. Instead, his novel takes our 8th graders on a journey down the Mississippi River with a young man who confronts what is complicated, messy, and real about the world. As Huck's sense of morality develops, so too do students' realizations that what their conscience says, it may be at odds with what society tells us. One of my favorite lines from Civil Disobedience is when Thoreau asserts that anyone who unjustly take a plank from a drowning man must give it back even if it means he should drown in return. This is the kind of realization that Huck has when he considers writing a letter that will reveal the whereabouts of Jim, an enslaved man who has joined Huck on his escapades. Through a beautifully muddled, wonderfully real thought process, Huck decides he will not do it. He will not be the author of a letter that returns a man to slavery, despite the fact that in so doing, he breaks the law. As he tears up the letter, he says, "All right then, I'll go to hell." When the world told him that to oppose slavery was a sin, his conscience tells him that the just thing to do is to protect Jim. When I first read this novel with students early in my career, I found this challenging to explain until an incredible mentor shared some inspiring advice about reading that I have since made my own mantra. I remember that I was telling her about how I introduced the novel with a seminar on whether or not, in some circumstances, it might be just to lie. After all, Huck ends up lying in such a way as to protect Jim's identity. Confused, my mentor asked me, "Did you start the book?" I said, "No, I wanted them to think about virtue first." She shook her head lovingly and said, "Kelly, you have to get into the world of the story and let Huck drag you around by the nose." These words have stuck with me. I want to read books in such a way that I do not impose an interpretation or a narrative. Certainly, I guide a line of inquiry, but at the end of the day, I want to let students work out the tricky moral dilemmas of life alongside the characters that they meet and get to know. There is nothing new under the sun, as the author of Ecclesiastes tells us, and Huck's worries are not all that dissimilar from our own. Here then is the essence of my address today. When students spend time with Huck, they encounter a boy weighing moral decisions. They consider what would be just, and they form their own opinion. And then they weigh it against what they have discovered as participants in the great conversation. I sometimes envision Twain leading my seminars and telling my students, "Well done. Life is complicated, is it not?" As upperclassmen, our students read some novels that are heavier, and they have even more complex considerations of justice. In Crime and Punishment, students find themselves living within the mind of a murderer who has justified his murder, his evil taking of a life with fancy rhetoric and morally bankrupt logic. And though I hate to spoil it, he almost gets away with it. Yet in his own mind, the wheels of justice turn. Students see that the weight of sin on one's soul is sometimes the greatest punishment. We rightly call out the murderer. We want to see him punished. And yet the reader is drawn to Sonia, a young lady who sees a path forward for Raskolnikov, believing in his possible redemption. The court punishes Raskolnikov rightly for his crime, but does not Sonia, with her limitless compassion and hope for a better, merciful world, present a more nuanced portrait of justice? In A Tale of Two Cities, students are confronted with injustices of pre-revolutionary France, the immense poverty and social disparity so dominant in the time. They feel alongside the poor residents of Saint-Antoine, calling for justice to burn the regime down. And then they encounter one of the revolution's leaders, Madame Defarge, who equates justice with revenge. In her quest to right society's wrongs, she is willing to spill any blood, even that of an innocent person who is just simply tainted with noble lineage. Dickens describes her as a tigress besmeared with blood. And we ask the students, is this just? As the old adage declares, two wrongs do not make a right. Revenge, we find, may not be the best source of justice. But of course, our students know this because they've read some of John Locke, who makes it clear that humans ought not be their own judges. Can you see we are doing something truly special at Thales? So much of our curriculum provides room for meditation on these virtues. And finally, what about our even younger readers? Let me give you one example from my own experience reading Tuck Everlasting with students. In this story, we meet a family that has accidentally stumbled upon immortality. At least one man, described as the man in the yellow suit, knows of the family's secret and hopes to profit from it. We learn that their immortality comes from a mysterious spring in the wood. Angus Tuck, the patriarch of the family, goes out of his way to warn the book's protagonist, Winnie, about drinking the water from the spring. He does not want her, a young girl, to share their immortal life. My students were shocked by this. Who would not want immortality? I dare not try to generalize Angus's advice, so I will quote it. He said, "Everything's a wheel, turning and turning, never stopping. The frogs is part of it, and the bugs, and the fish, and the wood thrush too. And people, but never the same ones, always coming in new, always growing and changing, and always moving on. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's the way it is." Is the natural cycle of life just? Angus thinks so, and his choices prompted my young students to ponder it too. In closing, I hope these examples help illustrate how through both serious study and experience with stories, we can discover and champion what is morally right and fair. I appreciate how simple David Hein made it in his new book, Teaching Virtue. He claimed, "Sound ethical judgment begins not with prescription, but with description." Characterizing the situation accurately and fairly, not what ought we do, but what is going on here. Our students are given the opportunity to describe during their time with us. So we trust it will be better for them to it will better equip them to answer the higher questions, what we ought to do in the future. So this year, I encourage you and your students to be attentive to just how impactful a classical curriculum can be. Assign readings and facilitate discussions that acquaint our students with the rich and intellectual and creative inheritance that has paved a path of unfailing truths from the forums of the ancient world to the gathering of the like-minded people in this room. The work we do is so important, and it really is not all that complicated. In many ways, it is common sense, but it does take time, patience, and thoughtfulness. By cultivating classical understandings of justice with intellectual discipline and moral imagination, we establish the patterns by which young people can try to live a just life. Thank you. I'm going to invite Mr. Brady up for our closing.
Well, I think there we've settled the issue. We've thoroughly explained what virtue is, why it's important to try to live lives of moral excellence, and some reasonable ways that we can go about encouraging people to live virtuous lives. From Mr. Luddy, we heard about the virtue of courage, and that we do just have to face our fears. Courage is the bravery that you feel when you should otherwise feel afraid. Dr. Esselin explained to us about the virtue of prudence and the ways that we can look forward into the future and make wise decisions in light of that. I tried to explain the virtue of temperance and the importance of looking to the future, not necessarily settling for cheap and immediate pleasures, but for things that last. And we heard from Ms. Scripter about the virtue of justice and how the books and the conversation that make up the hallmark of a classical education can inspire students to seek out these virtues in their own lives. So with that, I just want to thank everyone here for giving up your time to listen to these lectures, listen to these presentations, really to get our minds oriented to the task at hand, that of educating students and empowering them to reach their fullest potential. So I just want to thank everyone again, and I want to wish you well throughout this school year. If there's anything that you need, please feel free to reach out to myself or any of the panelists. We'd love to talk about this wonderful topic of virtue more. So with that, thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.